So the first thing, as soon as I saw it, I was like, wow, I want to make one of those.
I want to make one of those. Hi, it's Todd from Todd's Workshop here.
Matt Easton, Schola Gladiatoria.
And we have got a fantastic collaborative film for you today because we asked the Pitt Rivers if we could come down and look at their collection, choose pieces out of the cabinets and get them out and talk about them. And they said yes. And the Pitt Rivers Museum, amazing museum in Oxford.
You've got to visit it. It's like the density of amazing things they've got. It's incredible.
I mean, we started talking and we got 15 metres down the cabinets in about an hour. It's that kind of place.
But we've each chosen some things, different, very different, diverse things. And yeah, we're going to see what we can say about them.
And we're going to split it into two films. So the things that I've chosen, we're both going to be in it. We're going to put on my channel. The things that Matt chooses, both in it, on your channel. And we're going to start with this pellet bow here. I'm fascinated by them. So I've been making a pellet bow crossbow recently. Really interesting things. So they're for shooting stones or clay shot for hunting, not for war. You've got a little pocket here that I'm going to be very careful, but you put your shot on, you draw back, and you loose.
So the first thing, as soon as I saw it, I was like, wow, I want to make one of those.
I want to make one of those.
I remember when I was a kid, before I officially got into archery, I remember getting bamboo poles from the garden centre and making little bows.
Useful.
And it's just a piece of bamboo. But the string is actually where the technology is in this case, isn't it? But the first thing I thought when I looked at it is, I expected the string to be offset from the bow, and it looks like it's in a straight line.
Yeah.
So why doesn't the bullet go straight into either the bow or your hand?
Well, that is an interesting point. And I haven't made one of these, and I haven't shot one of these yet, because I am going to do that, because they've interested me for a long time, and I'm going to make one. However, when I do test it, I will be fully armoured up, I can promise you that. Because why doesn't the ball go straight into the back of the bow or into your hand? Has to be a question. But this one happens to be from Malay, and it's 1901 is the date on it. But it's also a Western European weapon. But interestingly, Colonel Pitt Rivers must have been fascinated by these things because there's 3 full cabinets of nothing but these from around the world. So you find them in cultures everywhere. There's a brilliant woodcut of gentlemen, and they are obviously quite posh gentlemen, on gondolas in the Venice Lagoon in the 1500s at some point, mid-1500s, and they're bird hunting with pellet bows like this, not pellet bows crossbows, but hand bows like this. And they're all, and there's a few of these boats dotted around, and all the guys are standing up on the front shooting at birds with pellet bows. So it's an absolutely fascinating, interesting hunting weapon in Western Europe as well as Asia. How does it work? Well, I've never used one, and there'll be people out there who have, but my theory is it's a bit like a catapult. You've got a catapult like this, and actually the shot is going to go pretty much into the back of your hand. But at the moment of release, because that hand is tensed as well, and that hand is tense, at the moment you release the shot, your hand just dips away. That's kind of my theory, that you draw it back and you let go and there'll be a movement. But I don't know. So
one other thought of that, I know that, for example, in certain thumb draw styles of archery, when they release, they allow the bow, and it's the same in Japanese archery actually as well, they allow the bow to rotate in the hand. So maybe there's a technique to it. Now, I do have a bit of historical data by pure coincidence that I can throw into this. As viewers of my channel will know, I often research things around the Indian Mutiny. It's a particular war that really interests me. And I was reading the diary of a British officer in India, and in the bit before the Indian Mutiny begins, he's just going about his normal officer life in India, and he really likes hunting. And he learns how to use the pellet bow from the locals and goes out every day hunting birds with it. And he says that there is a technique to it. So that would imply that there's something different about it to what he'd done before.
Did it say if it was a pellet bow on a stock or pellet bow hand bow?
It was a handheld pellet bow, and he was hunting birds with it. And he used to go out every day and come back with birds, you know, so he was successful with it. But he doesn't give a lot more detail than that. But I found it fascinating that a British officer in 1857 was going out into the jungles of India and using one of these instead of using a rifle or a shotgun, you know. So, and a very good connection there to Pitt Rivers, of course. So to his era and his.
Well, it's conceivable that those two gentlemen would have met.
Absolutely, yes.
But the pellet bow interested me for years. Clearly, Pitt Rivers loved them as well. So, that's the first one of the objects that I'm interested in. So, Matt, and don't forget, this is now going to be, from here on in, on Matt's channel. And enjoy it for what it is now.
Yeah.
This is a piece that I would love to have seen as it was then. I'll take Matt on the other side.
Cheers, folks.
Bye. So it's back to one of my choices now, pellet bows. So I've been making one recently, pellet bow, stone bow. And this has got a few of them in. So we've got crossbows and things, Chinese repeating stuff. Very interesting, not today. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get these out of the cabinet because of where they are. But we have right at the top here, we have a Chinese pellet bow. So that's kind of where it began. And it's so serpentine and dragon-like, if you like. It's very un-Western European, I'd argue. And then we come down to this one here, and this is going to be the focus of what we're looking at today. It's a 17th century stone bow. So we've got steel reinforcing plates that run down the front and, to a limited extent, the top of the stock. But that's not, in a way, surprising, because I don't know what that bow draws, but it's probably 120, 140 pounds. But the stock itself is only 22 millimeters deep and probably less than that, 18 millimeters thick. It's not a lot of wood. And then we've got the trigger mechanism here. It's connected down to a lever. You can see a little knob protruding from the top of the stock there. And that's just for you to push down on with your palm. There's a little catch that holds it in. So you pop the catch, the lever comes out, and the whole trigger mechanism comes forward, collects the string, pull back, clip it in, ready to shoot. But the whole thing is so delicate. So if we look at the woodwork that comes all the way down to the back here, by that bulbous knob at the end, it's probably, again, 14 millimeters by 14 millimeters. There's very little wood in it. It's quite dark, so it's probably a walnut or something. But it's just a beautiful little thing. We've got a peep sight at the back. We've got a fold-down foresight at the front. Again, it'll have that little cord with a bead on it, like you've seen on my videos there. A little bit of a recess on the stock, so the string doesn't drag across it. It's just everything that a pellet bow should be, but effectively miniaturized. It's, you know, 2/3 scale or something. It's just so sweet. But really useful for hunting birds, hunting rabbits, that sort of thing. This, I suspect, because of the scale of it, is really much more about recreation. But it's just a fantastic object that was really fashionable and remained really fashionable from probably around 1500 through to about 1900. But then just going back through, they were really long-lived. So they started in China, as far as we know, around about 1200, possibly a bit earlier, but they got to Europe about 1400. They became the height of fashion in the 16th century. There's no 16th century bows here, stone bows. But then we end up all the way through to around about 1900, early 1900s, they're still making them. So this one at the top here is actually 19th century, mid to late 1800s. But that pattern, exactly that, and I've got one at home from about 1900. They're still there, they still exist. Whether they are for poaching, I don't know. Whether they're for messing about in the garden, I don't really know, but probably a little bit of both. But it's lever action. And lever action stone bows came in 16th century, really quite early on. So have you come across them, Matt?
No, not really. They're one of those things like here. I've seen them in cabinets, and I've seen them within the antiques field. You know, I've seen them in auction and stuff like this. But I've never used one. I've never really researched them much. I've always wondered how powerful they are. I've always perceived them more as a hunting thing than a war thing.
Not a war thing.
Yeah. In terms of the 19th century one, I guess it could potentially have some advantages over firearms for quietness. You know, if you're wanting to hunt birds, but you don't want to, make all of the local sort of wildlife
birds
scarper.
Or gamekeepers.
Yeah, maybe for poaching as well. Funnily enough, I used to spend quite a lot of time in France, and they're very common in France, and you literally see them in antique shops and stuff in France. So I think that they were really, really popular over there, but I don't know the reasons why.
So we just finished with Matt and the Cinquedea, and we're on to a couple of Viking age axes. I pulled these out because I love Viking age axes. And this is, I suppose, exactly that classic Viking battle axe.
A dane axe.
Dane axe.
Yeah.
You know, this is not as big as they got, but actually, the big ones like this are not that common. And that's why I've pulled out a slightly smaller one as well. So this lovely axe was found in the River Lee in Essex. It dates from 895 or 896 AD. quite precise. And I think that's when Thorkill took a boat across the river, probably a Tuesday afternoon at about 11 when the tide was coming up, and he dropped it.
Yeah.
That is the most remarkable dating.
A night out in Essex in 896 AD.
Joking apart, I mean, it could have been the site of, for instance, a battle and then a recurring battle, or a Viking camp or something.
Yeah.
So we're taking the mick, but actually there could be a reason that they.
I think they must have associated it with something that was known to have happened in that area that year.
I loved that precise dating.
Almost certainly it's from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, yeah. But it's the iconic, probably we should call it great axe rather than Dane axe, actually. And of course we find them in Norway and Denmark and Sweden, but we also find them in England, and you see them on the Bayeux Tapestry.
Yeah, so I mean Saxons also used it as well, but it's, you know, it's the modern shorthand to call everything from that period Viking. But obviously there was a lot of Norse activity, fighting and attacking and defending in Essex, you know, in Kent and all of the coastal areas like that.
Yeah.
And in fact, this one came from Suffolk, I think it is.
And Suffolk, of course, had been part of the Danelaw, so we've got very strong Danish particularly, but you could say more broadly Norse influence in Suffolk. Suffolk and Norfolk get their names pretty much from the fact that they were settled by
South folk and the North
those folk, yes, and the East Anglia. This was found in the southeast is interesting as well, because this area, particularly during the era of Canute and his successors, and even if we go all the way up to Harold Godwinson, Harold himself was half Danish. So you have to remember that the English at this point were heavily intermixed, especially at the nobility level, and these were often carried by nobles. They were very heavily intermingled with the Danish, and in some cases they were ethnically Danish.
Yeah. I mean, it's that mixing of cultures that has always made an invading race very successful, because it stops them being completely alien. But this example, it's lovely. It's a sort of of the larger axes, it's almost like a mid-sized one, because you get them bigger, but not that common.
There's one in the British Museum which came out of the Thames, which is unusually massive, and it's also very heavy as well. But there are other examples from the Thames, which are at the Museum of London, or London Museum, which there were about 8 of them, I think, and they vary in size and shape. And it's just interesting as well that the angulation difference between where the shaft would be and the edge varies. So very often they're in line with the edge, and sometimes they're tilted forwards.
Yeah, the smaller ones are often tilted forward a little bit, as indeed does this one. If we assume that that's the shaft angle there, you can see that the edge is actually leaning forward. The reason I pulled this out particularly is it is much smaller, but it's still just as much a two-handed fighting axe as this ever was. Just because it's smaller doesn't mean that it's a single-handed axe.
Although it could have been. It could have been.
It could have been.
Yeah, could have been.
But they were using smaller heads on long shafts as well. So
there's some question, incidentally. I know people will ask how long is the shaft of this, and really we've only got 2 sources of evidence to this. We've got art, and then we've got archaeology. We do have some Irish two-handed axes surviving from bogs where the shaft has survived. And what's interesting is they don't have wedges or pins at the top to secure them. They're actually slid up from the bottom, so they have a tapered shaft, so the bottom end is smaller. And they're actually shorter. There's also a couple of examples from sort of Central and Eastern Europe as well, and they would be about there on me. But if we look at the Bayeux Tapestry, we actually see people leaning on their axes, and you try and lean on a stick, and you'll find that there's a certain height at which you just don't naturally do that because it's not tall enough. So I would say that the Anglo-Danish ones of the 11th century anyway are about this height.
You don't necessarily have a shaft length because it's the right length.
Yeah.
Fashion has a part to play as well.
And personal, one person might, just the same as pole axes in the 15th century, there's no perfect length for a 15th century pole axe. They can be anything from 6.5 feet to all the way down to about 4 feet.
You look at that and you think, well, that is a really weighty weapon. But it's not, because again, it comes down to that classic thing that if it is really heavy, it's not a wood splitting axe, don't forget, it's a person splitting axe. And if it's really heavy, you can't fight with it. If you can't fight with it, the tool that you're using to do your job is non-functional. It makes no sense. It's about 5 millimeters thick here. If we come to this point on the edge, it's under 2 at the very most. A very slight reinforce at the end here, not a lot. And this is corroded, but not horrendously so. And so we've got a little, very, very subtle reinforce at the edge and then coming down. Looking at the analysis that they did on it, this is coming through as a Vickers hardness of 160 to 170 on most of the body. And then the edge was carburized and quenched, so basically heated up red, quenched. And that is coming through with a hardness of 350 to 450 on the Vickers scale.
Which is pretty hard by the standards of the day.
Yeah, you're getting up to sort of knifiness.
Yeah, it's about 45 Rockwell, something like that. So we're probably talking about the same hardness as most reenactment swords, for example.
Yeah, it's basically a chunk of something fairly close to spring steel, fairly hard, and not that heavy.
I've been asked quite a bit about the reinforced edges, I fell down the rabbit hole of researching. I had always, because the ones in the Museum of London have reinforced edges, I had assumed they all did. As I understand it, yes, some don't. So some of them just come directly in a direct line down to the edge, so very, very fine edge. But some of them do have this slight swell before they do the final edge bevel. My assumption is that might be to do with manufacturing. Sometimes they may be applying a steel edge to an iron body. But it might just simply be to reinforce the edge to make it stronger.
I think it's just reinforcing the edge because you need to lose the weight. If you don't lose the weight, you've got a weapon that will just keep on carrying through. You have to have it handleable. To do that, you lose the weight. If you lose the weight, you lose the strength effectively. So what you're doing is you're just building up that very fine edge. So instead of having an edge like that, you've got an edge like that.
And at this point, obviously, the best equipped fighters would be wearing a mail shirt, sometimes with long sleeves, sometimes coming down quite low, sometimes shorter. And if they can afford it, an iron helmet. And obviously, whether you intend to or not, occasionally this will hit an iron helmet or a shield boss or an opponent's weapon. And so if it can be a bit more beefy where it needs it, it's less likely to break and
Yeah, well, I mean, that's reason enough to not make the thing super hard. Because if you're hitting them with something which is 52 Rockwell, for instance, on a very fine edge onto a steel hat, you're going to lose chunks out of your axe.
Another thing that's interesting about these, and we know this from the Museum of London and a couple of other examples in the world, they often had a copper reinforced collar inside the socket. And people with reconstructions of these have noticed that is quite for that amount of edge, that's quite a narrow socket.
Yeah.
So you get a lot of torquing effect on that. So actually, it's quite common for these to break. And what's nice is if you look at the Bayeux tapestry, you can actually see one of these heads coming off one of the shafts. So that was obviously a weak point of these weapons because of having such a long edge. If you hit at the top or the bottom,
big leverage.
Exactly, yeah. So sometimes having that copper alloy, brass equivalent or bronze equivalent sheath around the shaft can just reinforce it a bit. But and we can't. I think we shouldn't understate how the Bayeux tapestry has made these as famous as they are. The famous scene with so-called Harold with the so-called arrow in his eye. Next to him has a falling housecarl with an axe. And there's a lot of assumptions. We don't really know who's a housecarl. We don't really know who's got an axe. Yeah. But if you look earlier in the Bayeux tapestry, you can actually see them at the Royal Court, with these big axes. So I think they're noble weapons.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the case as well. But also, it might just be with the Bayeux tapestry, for instance, you draw them big because partly it makes them noticeable, partly it shows what they are in a way that a smaller version doesn't, and it makes them more exciting. So that is the end of my section of these films. But don't forget, we've just done the axes, and we're going to move across for the last bit on Matt's channel for the Chinese hook sword. Thank you very much. See you again.